China is shaping the global economic order in a few ways. First of all, simply by their economic activity. China's got a lot of gravity, both as a producer. It's one of the world's most efficient manufacturers now, so it attracts a lot of foreign investment. It has also, because it's got a lot of consumers, it's got a lot of buying power, and companies in every sector in the Fortune 500 and all the way down to the bottom 500 are thinking about the China market. So simply by its economic gravity and by 30 plus years of pretty good economic governance, that's hard to imagine today with some of the mistakes they're making. But by and large, a relatively well-run economy has made that gravity power stronger. So that's the first thing. The second is that the Chinese are much more active diplomatically, both the government and companies in international economic institutions, ones that are state-based and ones that aren't state-based. Security, human rights, economics, all across the board. They started that in the 1980s, first just going to meetings after they rejoined or joined organizations for the first time, then starting to make contributions, still largely learning, and then in the last 10 years becoming much more active, and then certainly under Xi Jinping trying to really assert Chinese interests in these institutions, and given their economic gravity, when they talk, people listen. So that's really, that combination of economic power is translated into diplomatic power in all of these institutions. The Chinese certainly think so, right? The Chinese start with the premise that they didn't create these institutions for the most part, even though they've been members of them for a long time now, and that its contribution to global GNP, to trade, has all grown faster than its influence in these institutions, at least its official position. So, we could sum that up, I think, in our minds as voting power, and what percentage of China has, what percentage of vote does China have in the IMF or the World Bank, or its seat at the permanent seat on the UN Security Council, or things like that. The Chinese describe that as hua yuquan, basically their voice. And they are trying to establish that voice and increase it across institutions. Again, human rights, security, economics, in every single field. And until they, for them, they're trying to promote, obviously, issues that are important to Chinese national interests. But they want to also just have the, respect that they think they're accorded because of they see themselves rising economically, which they think is inevitable, and therefore they should then be one of the leaders in just about every one of these institutions. So they've been pushing very diligently across the board in just about every sphere: finance, aid, the internet, trade, high technology and intellectual property rights, to have a lot of influence in shaping every single one of those types of regimes. I think it's surprising for most people to hear the truth, which is that, generally speaking, when we go from 0 as totally satisfied and 100 as totally dissatisfied and an anti-status quo revolutionary power, that the Chinese are down in most areas between 0 and 10. For the most part, they are relatively satisfied with the basic rules of the games in almost every sphere of economic activity. And the reason they are is very simple. They benefited tremendously. they've benefited more than just about any other country from the existing rules of the game. And secondly, over the 30 plus years that they've been involved in these institutions, they've begun to be socialized by these institutions to believe in these institutions. The Chinese believe pretty firmly in the basic rules of the WTO, both the rules that are about liberalization as well as the rules in the WTO that provide legitimacy for countries to engage in protectionism under certain circumstances. The dispute resolution process is another example. The role of the IMF in promoting financial stability and helping countries in the midst of crises. The World Bank's job, the World Bank role. So for the most part, they are relatively satisfied, but there are some areas where they're not satisfied, like many other countries who are in the system, and they are promoting a variety of policy changes in the way the WTO is governed, regional trade arrangements, foreign aid, as we saw with AIIB. But those changes are relatively modest in terms of the substantive changes that they want. They're more obvious in terms of just China wanting to have bigger influence, having a bigger seat at the table. I'd say if there's an area of economic governance where they are most concerned about, I will point to two. The first would be internet governance. And there they are much further down the scale towards seeking very substantive changes through the promotion of this idea of internet sovereignty, which for them, the internet isn't just about trade and economic growth and innovation. It also has an obvious political element to it, since there's a lot of content and ideas that go across the internet that they typically feel that they should be able to control information because it gets to the authority of the party. So there they stand out in how radical their views are. And I think that's probably the most dramatic. Probably less dramatic, but still very significant, are their concerns about the global financial system and their concerns about volatility, instability in a world where there's free flow of capital. Again, something that they don't control. So when they don't control something, they get nervous about it, particularly when capital flows are so large. So they've been coming forth with ideas about ways to sort of slow down liquidity, slow down the financial system so that they can exert a little bit more control to try and tamper down volatility. And that puts them in somewhat disagreements with the U.S. It's actually more similar to European positions, but nevertheless, it's still relatively different from the status quo. So by and large, their differences with the U.S. and others are about China's overall power, not the substance of their positions, but there are a few areas where they are taking distinctive positions, particularly on internet governance, but also on financial governance. I think that's a great question, whether China created the AIIB to shape the global economic order. I think what China was looking for was practice. For the most part, China has, again, integrated itself into existing institutions and their rules, both the good rules, the liberal rules, and the protectionist, mercantilist rules that exist. So we shouldn't get carried away with thinking that the current world order rules and the status quo is just about liberal, free, fair, just system. There's lots of existing rules that the Chinese have learned to game, just like others. But in that system, they've mostly been followers. And even though they've promoted specific rule changes within institutions, AIIB is the first new institution that they came up with. It is and for them, it's an understandable place to focus. They've been one of the world's largest recipients of multilateral development assistance. They also engage in large-scale infrastructure projects abroad. So it's an area that they are relatively comfortable with compared to other areas. So they didn't come out with a new alternative to the IMF or to the World Trade Organization or a new intellectual property rights regime. They came out with something on aid. And it's a relatively, in the global scheme of things, although it's really important to a lot of different countries, it's a relatively small corner of the global economy. So they're starting there. It's space that others haven't tried to dominate. Also, since there are about a dozen multilateral development institutions regionally, I think their view is that they could make a contribution here, influence, grab a little limelight, and be able to say that they're not trying to overturn the apple cart or the rules of the game. And since the Asian Development Bank is dominated by the Japanese, they thought, well, if we come up with something new, we don't like the Japanese so much. We would be surprised if others do. So people aren't going to be too upset with AIIB, which should be a counterweight or an alternative to the Japan-led Asian Development Bank. So I think that's why they started there. I don't think it's the first step in the creation of an entirely alternative global economic architecture centered in Beijing. I do think it's about a gradual shift of overall weight in the system, but within the existing system. I don't think AIIB is going to break the system. I think we could live with AIIB. I think the Chinese are obviously going to come up with new AIIBs in other areas. I think for the most part, they will be manageable. I think it's important to remember, and this is the last point, I'm droning on and on, is that whether these institutions are challengers to the existing system or not depends not just on the Chinese motives and what they do, it also depends on our reaction. So we often say, if you treat China like an enemy, you get an enemy. If you treat Chinese new institutions like they're alternatives to the system, they may end up being alternatives to the system. But there's ways to integrate them, co-opt them, make them fit within the system. Just as we started, Chinese influence comes through both its economic gravity and its participation in these institutions. So on the economic side, it's the first thing it needs to do is to get its economic house in order and move firmly on a transition from one economic model to another. Instead of being an investment-led, export-led economy that manufactures at relatively low end, they need to move up the value-added chain, shift towards consumption and services, become much more efficient. That is the cornerstone of them increasing their influence. Without that, everything else will end up being like sand and drift away, regardless of how good they are diplomatically. So that's certainly where they're starting. And as they move up the value-added chain, as they become have higher productivity, then they will then become more involved in various economic institutions. As China has more developed financial markets, better understands how financial markets work, I would expect them to take a bigger voice in financial institutions, in the IMF, the Basel Accords, the Financial Stability Board, in a range of those institutions as they develop more intellectual property, not just file it and record it, but also commercialize it. They'll have a greater voice in intellectual property rights institutions and rules related to competition policy. So I expect we'll see them move not only up the value chain economically, but up in those institutions that govern higher value added parts of the global economy. So I think those things ought to move in parallel. If they get out in front of themselves diplomatically when their economy isn't doing well, then that's really not going to be very stable for them, and they won't be able to maintain that influence for very long. So again, I go back. The sound. I don't mean to make it sound Marxist or anything, but really their economic trajectory is the foundation for everything else that they do.